Tenang telah membawa resah, resah telah membawa kau kemari. Tapi kamarmu bukan di sini dan kau merantau lagi. The calm has brought the storm. The storm has brought you here, but your room is not here, and you wonder once again. Welcome to Norse Nusantara, where I bring you voices in art and living heritage that define and disrupt ideas about the Nusantara, the world's largest archipelago. Kennie, glad to have you on our show and very excited to explore the richness of the Nusantara through your book, The Great Port Cities of Asia. Please introduce yourself and your amazing new book.
Thank you so much for having me here, Noor, on Norse Nusantara. I am Kennie Ting, the erstwhile director of the Asian Civilizations Museum and the Peranakan Museum. I am also a writer, a photographer, and I like to say historian, but I see myself more as a sort of travel sort of journalist. The Great Port Cities of Asia is my latest book. It's really a labor of love. It tells the tale of the rise and fall of empires and port cities across the span of some 2,000 years. And I delve into the histories and culture and heritage of some 60 port cities across Asia and the Indian Ocean.
Mm-hmm. And well, Kennie, it's fascinating to see the histories and evolution of this entrepôts in your book. And could you tell us how it's linked to the Nusantara?
Yeah, so the one thing you notice about my book is that it's actually not linear in terms of its narrative, right? So it's got multiple narratives that take place at the same time. I look at how the history of certain key port cities develop in specific geographical regions. So one particular and very important thread through the entire book is the story of port cities in the Nusantara, or the sort of the larger archipelago. And this is something that I'm particularly fascinated with because, of course, we're in Singapore and we're in the heart of the Nusantara. And so I take it as a way of us looking at the heritage of Singapore going back some 2,000 years. And I know today we have sort of a plan to talk about a few key port cities in the Nusantara, from Kedah to Palembang to Melaka to Aceh to Singapore.
Yes.
And by way of that, actually explore how Singapore today is actually not very different than these sort of historical and ancient port cities. Now, these Nusantara ports are very important because they were a kind of gateway between China as well as India and the rest of the world. At multiple points in history, China was either kind of closed off or opened up to maritime trade. And when China was closed off to maritime trade, they kind of outsourced this sort of like position of, trading to a port city or an entity in the Nusantara. So whenever there was this point where China was sort of turned its back against the world and world trade, then there would be the emergence of a particular entrepôt port city in the Nusantara that serves that purpose. And actually, while the talk is about the Nusantara in general, my interest in terms of these ports is in that part of the Nusantara that is more specifically related to I guess the Orang Melayu, the peoples of the Malay part of the Nusantara. Again, because these are the parts that are nearest and closest to us as Singapore. So it'd be quite fun to talk through, that rise and fall of these port cities in this specific part of the world, because we don't really talk about it so much.
Yes, and let's start with your first port of call, which is Kedah. Tell us why you started with Kedah.
There was actually a very simple reason why I wanted to start with Kedah, which was that I wanted to start the entire narrative with a piece with ACM and a piece at the ACM.
Yep.
And this piece is one of my favorites. It is a small, sort of like 20 cm high, a bronze figurine of the Buddha that was found in the Bujang Valley in what is today's Kedah state. And this is such an important piece, actually, because it highlights the fact that there was a very ancient Hindu-Buddhist civilization that existed here in this region, in the Malay Peninsula. That and it was also sort of like earlier than the great sort of Angkor civilization, which people remember very popularly. Most people don't really remember that there was this particular civilization here in Kedah, and that it was sort of Hindu-Buddhist, right? So I thought that it was very important to start the story with this piece. Another reason is because we know also that parts of Southeast Asia were heavily Indianized. And this particular piece also harkens back to a time when it was quite possible that these sort of Indian sort of Hindu Buddhist merchants and perhaps also Brahmin priests, monks came across the oceans to Southeast Asia and left their faiths here because the Buddha itself betrays aesthetically this link to Indian art at the time.
Okay. It's interesting you mentioned that this work of art, this bronze Buddha figurine is even older than, the popular archaeological sites of Angkor and also Borobudur. But, there was public outcry when some parts of this archaeological site was demolished by a land developer. How do such things actually happen?
I feel like partly it's because it's so not well known. I mean, it's not as well known as Angkor. But also, I don't know, maybe because there's the fact that, it's a Hindu-Buddhist civilization, which may not square very strongly with contemporary Malaysia's own outlook of itself. It is a majority of the population is Muslim, and somehow or other, maybe there was less of this consciousness of there being an ancient Hindu-Buddhist civilization in Peninsular Malaysia. That said, quite a bit of the site has also been preserved, and there is a sort of like Bujang Valley Archaeological Museum and site. So I understand also at least that there are some efforts made to try to also see if this could be a sort of UNESCO World Heritage Site. So I think I'm hopeful that this is just like a blip, but actually there is a tremendous sort of effort and interest to try to remember and preserve the site.
Well, I certainly hope so too. And I think one great way of starting that is, of course, through your book and, having a greater context and understanding towards that. And from Kedah, I think our next port of call is the Palembang in Sumatra. And it sort of opens up a window into the Srivijaya Empire. And there's a beautiful artifact which that's in your chapter, the Sabu King King stone. Tell us a bit more about that.
Again, in the early parts of the book, I wanted to sort of anchor the narratives in these archaeological works of art that are in museums. So this particular piece kind of echoes the Kedah Buddha. This piece is quite important. It's dated to supposedly the early decades of Srivijaya. And there are other pieces that are similar to this particular piece that have been found, across various places in Sumatra. So this stone was also very interesting because on the stone is actually sort of etched a sort of oath. And there was a specific use of this stone. Those who had the stone were supposed to use it in a way to sort of swear fealty to a larger kind of overlord. And this overlord happened to be the Maharaja of Srivijaya. It tells us a couple of things about Srivijaya. The first was it gives us a sense of the extent of Srivijaya, and it sort of covers, of course, parts of Sumatra and a peninsula, Malaysia, possibly also a little bit of Java. The other thing that it shows us was that Srivijaya was possibly not an empire in the classic sense of the term, where there is just kind of like one absolute ruler that conquers lands, and then everyone is expected to be subject to this one ruler. The fact that this particular Maharaja had to go around and sort of try to persuade people to swear fealty to him shows that it was possibly more like a circle of different smaller kinds of like kingdoms or political entities swearing fealty to one of their own that somehow managed to, provide a better, like a benefit and protection and security for all. And in scholarly academic terms, there is a specific term that's used for this. So it's called a mandala, where it's not, where there is a loose association of these entities that swear fealty to a particularly kind of stronger kind of overlord or chieftain in return for benefits, which would be, like I said, security, or possibly in this case, the wealth that comes from trade. And I think at this point also I should point out that, all of these things aren't just coming from my mind alone. I've actually referred to a lot of research and academic work that's been done in this field, and particularly for Kedah and Palembang, because they're kind of like, I think, related. They're part of within the same.
Kind of run parallel.
Yes, they're in that same chapter. There were two books that I thought were quite critical, and I used both of them actually in some ways for both chapters. The first is actually this. I'm going to pop it out. It's very important. I want to just show this to you. This is a very seminal text. It was an exhibition that was put on at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It was called Lost Kingdoms, Hindu-Buddhist Sculpture of Early Southeast Asia. It was curated by John Guy, who is really one of the most important experts in this field. I have deep respect from him. I have deep respect for him. As a museum professional, and a lot of, I would say, quite a bit of the knowledge that I reflect in the chapters on Kedah and Palembang came from what was in this sort of very seminal museum exhibition catalog. The other book that's been very important for Kedah and Palembang is this one, Ancient Southeast Asia, written by John Mixick and Go Gyok Yen. Also, again, like immense respect for John Mixick. We work with him at the museum. He advises us actually on archaeology and also our acquisitions. And this particular book was so important for me in terms of providing a sense of how these ancient port cities and political entities are linked. In Southeast Asia. And this is also where I draw, I find the term mandala as used to the specific sort of political structure, perhaps, that applies to Palembang, but also Kedah.
Okay. Right. Lovely. Thanks for sharing these books, Kenny. I mean, this is great stuff for building up your Christmas wish book list. So would you say that this Srivijaya empires, I mean, hearing from what you described, they're not like as what we know of conventional empires or civilization where it's really entrenched, right, and built with fortresses. It seems like they have their own satellites and perhaps say something about like kind of a reflection of the unique Nusantara geology or ecology of water.
I think that, to me, what is interesting about the Nusantara and the archipelago is exactly as you said, that it's not so much about the land, but about the water.
Yes.
And again, quite early on in the book, in the Kedah chapter, I make a point of saying that the Nusantarans, I mean, there's no good term to call the peoples of the archipelago today. I conveniently call everyone the Malays, but that's in the book. But that may not be the most,
It's a broad
correct term. But broadly, I
Yes.
call them the Malays. And I make it very clear that they are actually, the Malay peoples of the archipelago are actually extremely sophisticated. They are masters of the sea. They were then and they are today. And later on, we'll go into this in the other chapters also, I note that like part of being this Malay is this link to trade. Because for centuries there have been trade between the islands of the archipelago. And, it was well known that the sailors of the Malay archipelago were some of the best in the world, the abilities to sort of like go navigate the stars and navigate waters. Being part of an archipelago where everything is traded freely also meant you were free peoples. I cannot imagine the entire archipelago being, being willing to subject themselves to one particular overlord. I think that's why there was always, a need for whoever came into power to try to sort of persuade the lesser datuks, right? The lesser kind of chieftains, or in the larger archipelago, to swear fealty, to swear loyalty. A circle of kings rather than a sort of Game of Thrones is what I say in the book itself. And also I think this also affects particularly the notion of like kingship and country, but I think we'll go into this in a little bit.
Yes. And well, on the topic of kingship and countries, I mean, in your book, you write that it's a mighty Srivijaya Empire, but why don't we see a lot of its material legacy?
Yeah, and this is something that's quite interesting. One of the things I also try to explore in this particular book is different definitions of the word city in different cultures and languages. In the English language, we have a particular notion of what a city is. But in other cultures and languages, a city, it isn't translated the same way. It could mean different things. And in the sort of like the larger Nusantara, the city is often translated as negeri. And but that does not mean the same thing as a city. In that, we tend to think of cities in the sort of a terrestrial sense as a place where they're like hard, like buildings and there are walls and everything is very like permanent and fast and it doesn't kind of like move.
Right.
But that's not the case in the Nusantara. Again, because of the mobile maritime nature of the entire region, the cities themselves are also often sort of impermanent and mobile. So one of the theories, again, this is not my theory, but one of the theories for Palembang is that, the cities were like cities on the water. Right. And cities on the water, if you have a conception of it, it would be these structures on stilts. It would be people that live perhaps on boats. And they're not meant to be permanent. At any time, they could just pick up and sort of move. And it's quite possible that the big sort of port city that was Palembang was actually a city that was kind of like what's the term, like air, the water city. There's
Tanah air.
Tanah air.
Yes.
Basically,
Yes.
it was basically a kind of Tanah air, which meant that it may not have left much tangible trace of itself in terms of stone structures. Everything would have been sort of like, you could take apart and move anytime, which is also very sustainable if you think about it.
Yes, and nomadic in a way. Yeah. Well, on the topic of mobility and maritime, there was a disruption with the Srivijaya Empire that led to the discovery of Singapura in the 13th century. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, although it's not really so much in my book, but I think there was, obviously, there's also the rise and fall of the different kinds of mandalas, as you said, term mandalas in the region. And along, just kind of after and alongside Srivijaya emerged, that was the Majapahit Empire. And in the midst of the rise of another power, there was a certain degree of conflict. And legend as in basically, in the Sejarah Melayu, the Malay annals, that a prince from Palembang of the Srivijayan Empire fled as the Majapahit forces were attacking, and left to establish, a negri or a kingdom in Singapura. So that's the story of that, and of course the idea that there was a 14th century kingdom in Singapore has recently also been kind of corroborated through archaeological evidence dug up on land around ACM and Fort Canning, but also in the sea.
Okay. Wow. So the Majapahit is coming into our narrative right now, and from Singapore, we are moving into Melaka, where the Majapahit is involved, right? It's sacked the Lion City.
Yes. So we briefly sort of hop over Majapahit because we're my focus was on the sort of the lands of the Orang Melayu, not so much Java. So we kind of skip over Majapahit. They come and they kind of like sack Singapore, and then the last king of Singapore. We know all this in the textbooks. Last king of Singapore goes and establishes a Melaka, and Melaka then becomes basically the greatest entrepôt in this western part of the Nusantara, taking over from Kedah and Palembang before it. And it's got great kind of like what do you call it? It's got good genes as well, because its genes go right through to Palembang, right? So in some ways, it's the heritage of between Melaka and Palembang by way of Singapura is there.
Right. And speaking about Melaka, and now we're, of course, this genealogy back to Palembang. And in a way, you've also talked about how Melaka, in the latter part of the 15th century, was in its golden age. And could you tell us how then Melaka played a very important role to define what it meant to be Malay?
So before we do that, I think I need to point out the other book that's very important that, I referred to copiously. You can see a lot of these kind of like, the post-it notes here. This is a very recent translation of the Sulalat Salatin, which actually means the genealogy of kings. It was we often refer to this text as the Malay Annals. This was the British, sort of the 19th century British title of the translated text at the time. So I referred to this, which tells the full story of Melaka. It sort of links to Palembang, how it became the entrepôt trade du jour of the time, and what happens after Melaka falls. So there are two key instances in Melaka's history that's quite important. One of them is exactly as you said. So what happened was, at some point, Melaka became or converted to Islam.
Okay.
If you remember, the last king of Singapore who fled to establish Melaka would have been Hindu Buddhist. Basically, is in the Hindu Buddhist tradition that has governed most of Southeast Asia's history at the time. But at some point, based on research has been done by Professor Wang, possibly the third Melaka king converted to Islam. And in some ways that was a strategic move, because already by that time, the larger Indian Ocean trade would have been dominated by Muslim merchants from the Persian Gulf, so Arabs and Persians, but also from India, Gujarati, merchants at the time. And strategically, it would have been very smart to sort of tap onto that network of Muslim trade and merchants in the larger Indian Ocean. Melaka wasn't the first polity in the Nusantara to convert. This was actually Pasai.
Okay.
In Sumatra. And but in doing so, immediately it made itself very, very valuable to the larger Indian Ocean trade.
Okay. And this just reminds me of how we started, where you spoke about Kedah, right? How it started with China, but then we see the evolution now going into with the Islamic network. And how would these sort of evolutions then, with Melaka establishing itself, being referred to as the golden age of its time, in its definition of what it meant to be Malay? Because they devised that, right? They kind of formalized that in a way.
Yeah. Well, Melaka became very rich and powerful because of the trade with China and the West. And maybe I should explain that a little. I mean, trade in some ways has always been about how people try to get access to luxury goods in
resources,
China and Southeast Asia, etc., and to bring it back westward to the Middle East. To the Byzantine Empire and to Europe eventually. So the role that the entrepôts played was to sort of facilitate that trade. So, whenever merchants came through this part of the world to try to get to China, somehow or other there would be certain perhaps it was like duties imposed, or there wasn't like a free trade. So basically, somehow whoever held the gates to trade extracted duties and wealth from that trade. So Melaka played that role.
Okay.
And so it grew very rich as a result, and one of the sort of the richest polities in the region. And with wealth and affluence comes like the ability to invest in things like culture and heritage and literature and clothing and such. And in many ways, what happened in Melaka with this kind of blending of the prior sort of Hindu-Buddhist tradition with this new faith, Islam, is there was a creation of a new kind of material culture and creative expression. And there was ability to sort of define the faith in ways that made sense to this particular part of the world. There was ability to define kingship in a way that would sort of not forsake entirely the previous Hindu-Buddhist traditions, but be aligned with Islam. So, for example, in previous Hindu-Buddhist tradition, the idea was that the king was a kind of avatar of like the divine on earth. But of course you can't have that in Islam. Yeah. So in Islam, the king is a kind of, like in service to God. But there was still this idea of a kind of link to divinity. And there were sumptuary laws, what you can or cannot wear. Like, for example, only royalty could have gold or yellow, or have a yellow umbrella or held over them. So there were these symbols that were then defined, laws that were codified, that in some ways defined what it meant to be Malay. And this is something, again, I learned from this collector of krises in Singapore, Mr. Suhaimi. And I haven't seen him in a while. I should go say hello. Yeah. But we had a very long conversation some time ago about the story of Melaka in the context of his amazing collection of kris or ritual blades. Yeah,
gosh. Perhaps that could be on a topic for our next podcast.
I strongly encourage it.
Yes. And so what happened to Melaka, Kenny? I mean, this mighty empire.
Yeah, so almost everybody knows that the Portuguese came and sacked Melaka, but I don't want to spend too much time with the Portuguese, right? I think what's fascinating, and this is also in the Sulalat al-Salatin, is that after Melaka falls, and you barely hear of the Portuguese in the book because, who cares? The story doesn't end. So the story, you follow the last king, and then, as he sort of goes around the Nusantara, finding a new place, and you follow also the establishment of the future, like the sultanates of Johor and of Pahang and so on and so forth. And I found this very interesting and very strange. But then I did some more reading, and I realized, or I found out that there's like why this is so is also in some ways because of the specific nature of the term negri, right? We think of it as like a city or a capital city. There's Negara, which is country,
Yes.
but and again we think of this as fixed.
Yeah.
But in I guess the culture of the Malay world, the negri is not fixed. It is actually in some ways invested in and inherent in the body and the form of the datuk, of the
Yes.
chieftain, the king or the sultan, right? And wherever the sultan, etc., is, and the court follows, and there the negri is.
So it's embodied in the person.
We were on a tour yesterday.
Yes, we were.
Where Dr. Imran
yes.
bin Tajuddin mentioned the Bugis kingdom in exile, and that is entirely tied to this notion of the negri. So the king, might be in exile. It's not tied to the land. So wherever the king is exiled, there the negri is. And so what's fascinating is that therefore, you trace the presence of Melaka in its kind of subsequent kind of kingdoms later on. And even though Melaka, and I think it's because of that sort of like, that tie, the idea that even though that kingdom is no longer in that land, somehow it still exists in these multiple branches. I think it's partly this reason that even today, there within the Malay world and in all the Malay sort of like the sultanates of the Malay world, there is this kind of like nostalgia of memory, a very palpable sense of link back to Melaka.
Yes.
It's as though it never left us. And it's still inherent today in the various kind of negri and the sultanates that exist in the Malay world.
Okay. And in your book, there's this beautiful headstone of Nakhoda Haji Al-Kambai bin Jamaluddin. Interestingly, it's also in our Singapore National Museum collection. How is that symbolic to the rise, fall, continuity of Melaka?
I think that stone is often overlooked, and even though it's in the NM, I insisted that it's displayed at the ACM because it's so important to our port city narrative. But it's very interesting because of what it is. It is the gravestone of a Gujarati merchant that originates from Cambay, this very important port city of Cambay, today's Kambat in Gujarat, right? So Haji Ali Al-Kambai. Al-Kambai refers to the fact that he probably comes from Cambay in Gujarat. So it attests to the fact that Melaka was tremendously cosmopolitan at the time. There was a huge merchant community from all over the world, particularly a Gujarati Muslim merchant community there. The grave is dated 1459, which means that it took place just before Melaka's golden age, under the rule of the Sultan Mansur Shah. And there's painfully little by way of the tangible that remains from the pre-Portuguese period of Melaka. Most kind of like of everything we know from the pre-Portuguese period comes from historical text. It's textual. So this is one of the sort of very rare actual things that come to us from that particular period. And I like to read it symbolically because it's a gravestone, right? Symbolically, therefore, as like, at least in my book, I symbolically refer to it as a grave over multiple things. Like it's not just the grave of, Haji Ali Al-Kambai, the merchant. It's also kind of like, in some ways, a grave over the end of Melaka. That was the, and most evocatively, I think it is also kind of like a grave over the Indian Ocean trade as we imagine it before the Portuguese or the Europeans arrived. This was a trade that was laissez-faire. The seas were meant to be free. Nobody should have any control over the seas. But when the Portuguese came, the Europeans came, it was all about killing off that laissez-faire trade, killing off this idea that nobody had control over the sea. So to me, the gravestone is so sad because it is basically, it's like a capstone of a whole era. And it is also framed as a turning point in the narrative of my book.
Poetically said. Gosh, so from Melaka, we're back again in Sumatra, but this time in Aceh, which is known as the New Power. And there's this beautiful gold mesh bracelet that you have in your book. And then for me, it starts to tell me something different, that there's female agency already at play in this chapter. Please tell us.
So, I mean, that gold bracelet actually I chose to include because to me it meant two things. One of it is female agency, which is important. The other one was also to show you the wealth of Aceh, because wealth is always very important because that's an outcome of trade. Why do people pursue trade? It's because of the benefits of wealth. So, in the aftermath of the fall of Melaka, again, there was a need for an entrepôt.
Yeah.
Within that, so the Malay and the Asian merchants fled Melaka because the Portuguese tried to sort of clamp down and and not allow any Asian trade. So they had to find somewhere else to go. So they found various other places. Some of them went to Ayutthaya, some went on to like Makassar, but those are out of our ambit of the immediate sort of like a Malay world. So Aceh became in the interim also one of these entrepôt ports where the Malay and Asian merchants came to trade. And it was actually a very important port city, particularly because it was one of the sort of, it exported black pepper alongside India for a while. And it had close ties, again, with the various empires of the West. So it had close ties with the Mughal Empire, with the Safavid Empire, with the Ottoman Empire. In fact, at one point, the Ottoman Empire was actually trying to protect this sort of trade that was going from Aceh through to it's the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea region. So Aceh was a very important entrepôt, and we know that entrepôts grow rich. So what is very interesting is that actually its point of like great richness kind of coincided with a point also where it was being ruled by queens, which is very, very rare in any sort of like it's rare in general in any sort of like empire or kingdom, etc. I mean, the word is kingdom, right?
Yes.
So let alone an Islamic sort of like Muslim sultanate.
Yeah.
And this happened because of a sort of a very interesting coincidence. The great sort of like Sultan Muda Iskandar, which means Alexander the Younger, died without having a male heir. He had actually sort of had his son sort of killed. It's a very sort of Islamic, in the Middle East you have these sorts of like fighting where the fathers might fight with the sons and the siblings fight with each other. So he had died and there was no male heir. So interestingly, the Islamic the ulama as well as the nobility decided to settle on his daughter as the queen. And establish this sort of like this queendom basically in Aceh. And at this point also I want to point out that this particular book, which is actually so important. Again, I have sort of many post-its there. It is the Sovereign Women in the Muslim Kingdom, the Sultanas of Aceh, 1641 to 1699, written by Sher Banu A.L. Khan. And I drew very, not heavily, but this story of the queens of Aceh was, was actually based on research that's been done in this particular book. Tells the full tale of the sultanas. But so the sultanas themselves, their reigns coincided with a time of great peace and also great prosperity. They were often seen as actually being very weak, because what happened was that during their time, the geographical extent of Aceh actually shrank. That was because these women sovereigns decided to choose peace by conceding certain territories in order to maintain the peace in a way, rather than sort of they chose to give up certain things in order to sort of focus on peace and prosperity. And so historians often think of them as being kind of weak and ineffectual compared to like the male kings from before. But what I think sure Banu Khan argues is that this is not true. Actually, if you think about it, maybe it was the fact that they were experts in realpolitik. They understood that it's a give and take. So, I may give up certain things, but in return, I guarantee my sovereignty. Because one thing that the queens were really smart on was that they did not allow any of these sort of East India companies from Europe to establish like actual fortresses of stone in their territory, because they'd seen what happened elsewhere. The minute you allow the Europeans to come and establish their sort of like cities or settlements here in stone, I mean, the next thing you know, you're going to give up your sovereignty to them. They've seen what happened in elsewhere in the Nusantara. And so in that way, they managed to preserve the sovereignty. And it's amazing because Aceh managed to preserve its sovereignty for a good 200 years more. Until the 1800s, when it was finally sort of conquered by the Dutch. So these women queens had a lasting impact on Aceh's importance and independence.
That's amazing. I mean, when we talk about soft power, and still on the topic of Sumatra, it's known as the largest matriarchal societies in the world, including like the Minangkabau in West Sumatra. And there's a very interesting practice that they have, merantau. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. And I mean, I think this is a good point you bring up, because there is the question, how is it that there was this possibility of women being sort of at the head of the negri, so to speak, in the Malay world? And again, it is argued that this has links to the culture in these parts of the world where the men have to merantau, right? So the men have to go out and sort of make a living, and maybe they come back, maybe they don't. So actually the women are the ones who sort of hold on to the household, and they hold onto the purse strings, and they basically become the sort of heads of the family. And the Minangkabau are the most, I would say, obvious of these societies, where they're matrilineal, and it is actually the mother or the woman who holds, who's the head of the household. But certainly women have always had a much stronger role in societies of the Malay Malay-Indonesian world. I mean, even in Peranakan societies, the matriarch is the most important. Nobody messes with my mother.
Don't.
Basically, mother is queen, right?
Yes.
So definitely, I think the possibility of these queens rising to this levels of power is somewhat due to the important role women have within, I guess, the larger Nusantara community.
Yeah, that's amazing. And now that we have like merantau, much of Nusantara, and we circle back to Singapura, can you please tell us how are the legacies of these entrepôts you mentioned very important to Singapore, or as you describe in your book, Singapore Inc.?
Yeah. So one thing interesting again about, it was a key intent of my book was to sort of, alongside the usual colonial narratives of the colonial port cities, et cetera, was to also juxtapose, the other kinds of, I guess, empires or entities or port cities that were still in existence, right? So so basically, I'm very interested in Asian agency, for lack of a better term. So, all the port cities we've gone through today, what's most important to me was the agency that each of these entities and their sovereign rulers had the agency to decide their fate, their destiny. They played a key role in deciding succeeding in being the entrepot. So when we go to Singapore, I skip the whole raffles bit, more or less. And I immediately go into this, one has to decolonize something, right? So I immediately go into this, the independence bit, right? Where there was a decision made to keep or not the statue of Raffles and this idea of Raffles.
Yes.
And my argument actually is that it was a very strategic move, right? Because there was basically a UN team that had come down to advise of the government and the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew at the time. And the advice was, keep the Raffles statue because it meant that we were still open for business, i.e., we were still open to being an entrepot port, right? So in some ways, the move. We were ultimately, unlike other kind of countries around us, we were ultimately still motivated by the commercial and the trade
survival.
For survival, in the spirit of our whole kind of like port city entrepot kind of heritage, which I find is fascinating. But of course, in then kind of like retaining Raffles, right? Raffles became it became something else. It was no longer became a symbol of colonialism. It became a symbol of like commercialism. Basically, it became a symbol of. It became a brand. It became a symbol of Singapore Inc. Singapore as a kind of corporation, rather, Singapore as an entrepot port in a different way, that had implications on everything. Like you see, we plaster Raffles over everything, right? Raffles Hotel, which was from before. Raffles City.
Yes.
For a while, SIA had Raffles Class.
Yes, I remember
There's
that.
There's Raffles Montessori School. There's Raffles, the design school. What is it?
Raffles Design School.
Raffles Design School. And it means something. It connotes a certain kind of quality, but it also refers to Singapore, and it ultimately takes on this notion of an entrepot port. So my own take is that we have kind of recolonized this symbol of colonial power for our own use.
Nice.
Yeah. And I should probably highlight, so
please.
the Singapore chapter in my book actually was my master's thesis that I've never managed to publish. So it's kind of my master's thesis, but elements of it would appear in these two books that I wrote.
Let me help you with that.
The first was this book on Singapore Chronicles, which was an SG50 sort of series of publications helmed by the Institute of Policy Studies. And I was asked to write the book on heritage, which is basically a history of heritage preservation in Singapore. So I argue in one of the earliest chapters on, the role of Raffles in terms of, preserving this idea of us being an entrepot. Basically, keeping Raffles meant we kept our entrepot heritage.
So was this like your CV writing? Was this your CV for the job?
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why I got the ACM job. Yes.
Write a book.
And I think so. I would like to say that these two books remain the only two books today that take on heritage in its entirety. So everything from build heritage to museum collections to intangible cultural heritage to even natural history. So this is the other book that I wrote. And both these books were for commemorative reasons. Like one for SG50, this is for the bicentennial. And also, I think I include a little bit about, the main argument I have here is, again, today our sort of port city heritage is the same as it was in 1819, except for I think one key difference, which is that the agency is ours. We decided to hold on and establish ourselves as the entrepot, even after the British had left. And in so doing, in some ways, we're basically mapping ourselves back into these ports that came before us. So we are saying that we today are the Kedah and the Palembang and the Melaka and the Aceh of yore.
And speaking of books, Kenny, thanks for sharing the earlier publications that you produced. And still on the topic of Singapore, circling back to perhaps a much older resource again, going back to this book that you brought, the Sulalatal al-Salatin, Genealogy of Kings. the great epic of the Malays. So tell us how then this is again important to us understanding about our nations or our island early beginnings.
I think, during the bicentennial period, there was this kind of move to sort of move history backwards, right? So there's the idea that in school previously we would learn that Singapore's history starts from 1819 with Raffles coming. But during the bicentennial, a whole range of professionals in the larger heritage fields, so with museums as well as academics, universities, archaeologists, decided that we need to sort of move this timeline back to 700 years. 700 years means coinciding this with the supposed kingdom of Singapore that was here. And this was also, again, corroborated by the fact that there were archaeological troves found in and around the Singapore River and Fort Canning, and also in Singapore waters that corroborate this presence of a kingdom of Singapore that is that appears in the genealogy of kings as well. I guess Singapore is actually very important because it is, again, a very important turning point.
Yes.
It was the in-between point from the transition from Palembang to Melaka. A transitional point from a Hindu-Buddhist Southeast Asia or a Hindu-Buddhist sort of like Nusantara to a Muslim Nusantara. It's but a blip in the entire sort of history, but in some ways it's taken on a kind of mythical, legendary proportion because of how Singapore itself is so central, geographically within this particular region. And so I think that in some ways, symbolically, the fact that we are the equivalent, we are the entrepôt today, basically, of this whole region. It's part of our destiny to be so because it is already sort of articulated in the genealogy of kings. It's like a full circle. It's already come by once, and then it's gone off elsewhere, etc., etc. So it's like the negri, so to speak, the negri dash entrepôt, so to speak, sort of moves around in typical kind of like Nusantara fashion. It moves and it has landed itself here, where you like it or not, this will be the center of global trade and trade in the region for a while. So, I think, again, the significance of this is that, a lot of people think that Singapore is so brand new and it's like, we're a young country and we have no history. But the fact is that if we consider ourselves as the port city, as entrepôt, you see that we have a very, very long history. And it is not surprising necessarily that we are who we are today as the sort of premier entrepôt port city in the Nusantara.
Yeah. And so, Kenny, after exploring this great port cities with you, I feel like you've sort of presented us with an inverted telescope where we've seen the world through the vantage point of cosmopolitan Nusantara. What could be said about the significance of Nusantara societies from the perspective of the lands beneath the winds, as they say? Yeah.
The land beneath me. That's actually a very interesting term that, that we haven't quite talked about, but it is a very important term.
Negeri di bawah angin.
Yes. I explain it actually in the Aceh chapter, and there are many explanations as to what di bawah angin could mean. I choose to take it to mean basically the scope of what we've discussed today. The scope, basically the lands that more or less correspond to Srivijaya as an expression of the sort of ancient or historic Malay world within the Nusantara. So the di bawah angin is symbolically very important. The land spill. It's below the winds because it was the winds that blew everybody else from elsewhere sort of here. And a lot of times the ships came from above, right? So north from the sort of northeast or the northwest, coming down to this particular region. And so and if you think about winds coming from above and below,
Yes.
there's this idea that it's converging here
Yes.
in these lands below the winds, right? So I think one of the things I'm very fascinated by is this idea that perhaps the Nusantara was not at the periphery, but actually at the center of global trade, right? So, and you think about the Nusantara and this part of the region being at the center of global trade. You turn around a lot of existing, what I find, rather stereotypical points of, ideas about what Southeast Asia is, right? So one of the things you turn around, particularly in Nusantara, is this idea of, like you mentioned it, cosmopolitan.
Yes.
Right? Most people don't think of the Nusantara as being cosmopolitan, but that's rubbish, of course, because as somebody else said yesterday, Imran,
As you said, everyone was here.
First of all, Nusantara is so huge. And it's larger than Europe, right? So again, I'm repeating Dr. Imran bin Tajuddin's points. The Nusantara is so huge. Every single island, every single region has its own peoples and languages and scripts. I mean, it's as large as Europe. So Nusantara itself, right? This idea of Malay as an umbrella term is an umbrella term because it corresponds to like dozens and dozens and dozens of different like ethnicities and communities and faiths within this particular region. So this is just like the people who are here. And then of course everybody came here.
Yes.
The Chinese were here, the Arabs were here, and the Indians came, and the Europeans finally came. So we got the whole world, the Africans too, I'm sure. So we've got the whole world here in the Nusantara. So don't tell me that the Nusantara is not the center of the world.
Amazing. And Kenny, thank you so much. Such a great way to conclude our series, our first series, the Great Port Cities of Asia, looking through the lens of Nusantara. And Kenny, I just want to extend a heartfelt thanks for your insights and expertise that have really enriched our conversation today. So very grateful to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for patiently listening to me ramble on as usual. Thank you. Such a joy.
Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to this episode of Noor's Nusantara. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to this podcast to hear more from leading thinkers and creators on picturing the Nusantara.